Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 141, First Battle of the New Armed Militia. Wu Yijun smiled slightly and replied composedly, "Actually, I'm not the only person who noticed the strange closeness between the two of you. I mean, Xietain obviously doesn't treat you like a maidservant or a normal assistant, and he certainly cares about you and gives importance to your opinion when it comes to making important decisions. Who would do something like that unless they knew the other person well enough?" Lily simply smiled and didn't comment on the matter. In fact, there was nothing to comment on, and everyone could think or assume whatever they pleased. Seeing that she did not want to continue with that conversation, Wu Yijun shook her head and did not insist. If it were someone else, they might fear her, as her position in the group was quite high, but as someone who was under the direct care of Xietain, Wu Yijun's position was not something to be too afraid of, and as long as she was given the necessary respect, everything would be fine. After about 5 minutes, Xietain wiped away the few beads of sweat that had formed on his face and took a deep breath as he cancelled his blood manipulation skill, which caused the crimson flame to evaporate the liquid blood and extinguish in midair. From the forehead to the back of the body on the beast's back, a large gash could be seen as if it wanted to split the body in two. The metal armor of the reinforced iron boar was incredibly tough, and in order to cut through it, Xietain had to keep his blood manipulation skill active at all times, which had consumed a lot of his mana. After getting off the body, Xietain walked towards Xietain, the person in charge of this group, and ordered, "Start working now. The sooner you finish this, the better. In fact, if possible, I would like you to finish within 3 days at the most." 3 days. Xietain frowned slightly, but seeing the serious expression on his face, he dared not refuse, so he nodded hurriedly. "It will be difficult, but we will give our best effort to finish as soon as possible." Xietain nodded in satisfaction and gave him a light tap on the shoulder before pointing to a pile of Jiaolao snake scales that had been ripped off and said to Xiaomin, "When they are done with the scales, have someone take them directly to my villa." "Understood." Xiaomin nodded and sent the trio off before returning to work. On a road south of the beginning village, a convoy consisting of a modified bus, a Dongfeng truck, and 3 jeeps raised a cloud of dust as they moved forward without stopping. In the lead jeep, Xietain sat in the passenger seat looking out the window. Trees whizzed by, and he occasionally saw some zombies or broken corpses lying in the bloodstained grass. To reach Camp Baiquan, they needed to travel a considerable distance, but before that Xietain needed to clear the surroundings, collect as many resources as possible, find survivors, expand his power, and get the new armed militia used to battle slowly. Otherwise, should a battle break out between his group and the opposing camp, his troops would panic and flee at the first sound of gunfire. After driving carefully for about 2 hours and going through several obstacles blocking the road, Xietain made a gesture and Luo Qing stopped the vehicle at the roadside. Little Luo Ning was in the back seat chatting with Lilith happily. Feeling the vehicle stop the gear, she looked forward and asked curiously, "Big brother Bai, are we killing zombies?" "That's right." Xietain nodded and got out of the vehicle without another word. "I can finally get stronger myself too." The little girl jumped out of the jeep and looked at the surroundings with bright eyes. Luo Qing looked at his little sister, not knowing whether to laugh or cry as he saw the emotion in her eyes. This little girl had acted cuddly with Xietain all afternoon, and when she asked him if he could take her to hunt zombies, he didn't even hesitate and agreed. In fact, Luo Qing was grateful to him. After all, if Luo Ning could evolve and become stronger, it would be a lot better for her in case something bad happened to him, who was her only family. In this new world, power and, unfortunately, courage were needed. Fighting from a distance was fine for Luo Qing, but unless he had some kind of protection against the zombie infection, it was impossible for him to muster the courage to fight head-on. He got out of another jeep and stood next to Xietain as they looked toward the town 500 meters ahead. Behind, Fu Xiefeng and Kong Lan were giving some orders to the 30 armed men they had brought along this time. As for the rest, they had stayed in the beginning village protecting the camp. Xietain looked at Fu Xiefeng and the latter nodded before charging towards the town at full speed. With him currently reaching level 19 and using his points in agility and stamina every time he leveled up, as well as the sum of other stats gained, Fu Xiefeng was currently 5 times faster than a normal person who had not been nurtured by soul power. In a short time he arrived at the entrance of the small town and began to shoot noisily into the sky. The zombies in the area were attracted by the strong soul power emanating from him as well as the sound of gunfire and began to stagger in his direction. In a short time, more than 1,000 zombies gathered with the intention of surrounding him, and after killing several of them, Fu Xietain was forced to retreat, or else even he would die pathetically. The newly recruited militants sucked in a breath of cold air as they saw the wave of 1,000 zombies advancing towards them. 30 untrained armed men against over 1,000 zombies. They were naturally scared, and everyone couldn't help but take a step back. Just then, Xietan's voice resounded everywhere. "If any of you run away, your right as a noble citizen will be revoked immediately. Furthermore, if any of you dare to disobey my orders or those of your immediate leader, you will be forbidden the opportunity to obtain any other jobs and will have to settle for relief rations for the rest of your lives." At such a threat, the militants turned pale and did not dare to take another step. What a joke! Back to those days of suffering and hunger? No thanks. None of them were willing to lose the life they had just obtained. Xietain realized that although his words were somewhat effective, the hands of the armed men were trembling lightly as they gripped their guns tightly. At this rate, it was only a matter of time before they would all start fleeing when the 1,000+ zombies got too close, or they would simply start wasting precious ammunition. "Chen He, you watch them," Xietain ordered, and looked at Fu Xietain and Kong Lan before saying, "You two come with me." Without waiting for a reply, he rushed forward like a whirlwind. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 142 Against the Zombies. "Chen He, you watch them," Xietain ordered, and looked at Fu Xietain and Kong Lan before saying, "You two come with me." Without waiting for a reply, he rushed forward like a whirlwind. Before the newly formed armed troops could react to what was happening, Xietain had already crossed a distance of 300 meters in the blink of an eye. His body flickered like a flash of lightning, and under everyone's disbelieving gaze the head of a dozen zombies shot into the sky along with a torrent of blood. "Strong!" Fu Xietain exclaimed in shock. Although he was already infinitely close to level 20, but even he was unable to discern Xietan's movements distinctly before several zombies were decapitated. With 201 agility points, Xietain was simply a monster who was 20 times faster than a normal person in good physical condition before the arrival of the soul record on Earth. Although Fu Xietain was fast, there was still a great distance between him and Xietain. Kong Lan's beautiful eyes flashed with a hint of surprise and admiration as her idolatry towards him increased exponentially. No matter how many times she saw him, she never ceased to be amazed by the power of her leader. The two looked at each other and quickly charged forward to join the fray. Although not as monstrous as Xietain, Fu Xietain used a meter-long claw from one of the First Order Gale Cats to claim the lives of his enemies. As for Kong Lan, she could not use her poisonous cloud skill against the zombies as it, unfortunately, had no effect. Therefore, very carefully to avoid being scratched, she stood on the edge without being surrounded and casually decapitated the nearby zombies. As for the other militants, none of them managed to see anything before the zombies' heads flew off. In just a matter of 5 minutes, more than 500 zombies had been decapitated. Of these 500, most had naturally been killed by Xietain, since he was the only one with a treasure capable of protecting his body almost completely from infection. But even then, he needed some restraint. Blood ran like a river along the length and breadth of the road as headless corpses piled up close to each other. The zombies in the back even stumbled over the corpses of their dead comrades, becoming easy soul power for the 3 evolved ones who slaughtered them mercilessly. "You two, go back." After killing another 100 zombies, Xietain called Fu Xietain and Kong Lan to retreat. The duo did not hesitate and quickly retreated. Fu Xietain was starting to get exhausted because even though less than 10 minutes had passed, the amount of stamina consumed had been especially high, since although the zombies were only level 5 at the moment, the danger they represented was still present in all its splendor. As for Kong Lan, her stamina was relatively low, so her chest was constantly rising and falling. Her light clothing had clung onto her body, which was gradually becoming more and more charming as a result of the sweat, giving her a somewhat seductive but at the same time dangerous vibe due to the blood stains that had inevitably reached her. As the two safely retreated, Xietain decapitated another 20 zombies before backing away at full speed, appearing next to Chen He again in an instant. As he raptly glanced at the 30 armed men, Xietain noticed how everyone's eyes were burning as they stared at him in naked admiration. "Fuck." A militant whispered and tightened his grip on his gun as his whole body trembled uncontrollably. In fact, all the militants were trembling as they clutched their firearms. However, unlike before, this time it was not out of fear of the zombies, but because of the excitement bubbling in their veins and the adrenaline coursing through the bloodstream of each of them. Such ghostly speed. Such an ability to take on an army of zombies by himself. Such strength and such an aura brimming with confidence. If before they had joined the armed troops to feel safer and to live better lives, now they were also doing it out of admiration for the young men in front of them. With such leaders, what was there to fear? Xietain nodded, secretly satisfied with the result as he saw the morale of the armed troops soaring. In a battle, morale played an extremely important role. It was precisely for this reason that he entered the wave of zombies. To make a show of overwhelming power and let everyone see that there was nothing to fear. The remaining 400 or so zombies approached slowly but surely. Their white eyes and deformed faces were incredibly terrifying, but seeing the firm back of the leader in front, no soldier feared. As the zombies reached 100 meters range, Xietain easily noticed how panic threatened to return to the militant's eyes and knew that temporarily it was the best thing he could do. Fire at will. Xietain ordered loudly and casually took aim with his Desert Eagle before pulling the trigger. 100 meters ahead, a zombie fell noisily backwards, never to get up again. "Fire!" Chen He shouted, followed by Fu Xiefeng. The militants raised their guns and shouted to shake off the dread they felt as they unleashed a storm of bullets uncontrollably on the enemies. Type 54 pistols, Type 79 submachine gun, Type 85 sniper, all kinds of old firearms were fired by the 30 armed men and hundreds of bullets disappeared with every passing second. Among the wave of 400 zombies, some were shot in the abdomen, chest, heart, limbs, but they continued to advance without fear and without any sign of pain. They were creatures that, unless their brains failed to function, never stopped, and even those who lost mobility after being hit by some shots that damaged the bones of their legs made an effort to crawl before being crushed by those who came behind. Occasionally, there were some zombies who were shot in the head and died, but it was simply impossible for only 30 untrained men to stop 400 monsters without fear of pain. Therefore, when a zombie fell, another one behind would advance and take its place. This gave the illusion of an inexhaustible troop that chilled everyone's blood. Xietain and Chen He never missed a shot. Within a distance as short as 100 meters, Xietain Special Forces soldier skill and Chen He's sniper skill demonstrated their power to the fullest. Bang! Xietain aimed and fired, killing a zombie. Without even a second's delay, he took aim again and another zombie's head exploded a split second later. Seeing the ease with which he aimed and fired without even securing the target, Chen He was speechless. This was the first time he had seen Xietain use firearms in such a way, so he was naturally surprised. This man is really scary. Chen He thought silently as he killed zombies without a break except for changing the magazine of his gun. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 143, Constantly Evolving Zombies. Faced with the endless wave of bullets, the zombies were slowly beginning to fall. However, it was simply impossible for 30 inexperienced people to annihilate more than 400 enemies who felt no pain and did not fear death when the distance separating them was only about 100 meters. Cease fire. Retreat 100 meters. Xietain commanded deeply as the zombies approached 50 meters in front of them. The militants turned pale as a sheet when they saw, for the first time in a long time, so many zombies from such a close distance. Upon receiving Xietan's direct order, those who could barely contain the urge to flee as they remembered the consequences immediately turned around and began to run in disorderly fashion toward the second line of defense marked in advance. Seeing how disorderly the retreat was, Xietain sighed secretly and also retreated after making sure that all the men had reached a safe point. "On my signal!" Xietain shouted and while looking behind him ordered, "Fire in bursts. Don't leave the trigger pulled like idiots and aim for the head." As the now just over 200 zombies approached, Xietain ordered and the militants began to shoot in bursts. This caused the zombie kill rate to drop, but the accuracy increased dramatically as the vibration of the guns was far less. The ammunition savings also became noticeable and gradually the zombies began to fall. After retreating a total of 200 meters more than the initial 100 meters, the group led by Xietain had consumed 70% of the ammunition they had brought for this assault. Cease fire! Xietain shouted again as the number of zombies amounted to just over 60 and the militants gradually stopped firing. The fearful look in everyone's eyes had long since been nowhere to be seen, and as they looked at the less than 100 zombies approaching at a snail's pace, a bit of self-confidence began to be born naturally. This confidence came from the victory they had built together with their own hands. Luoning, are you sure you're all right? Xietain approached the girl standing next to Lilith and asked carefully. It's okay, big brother. Bye. Luoning nodded with determination and looked at the zombies more than 100 meters away without fear. Then, she looked at Xietain and smiled in a cute manner as she said, besides, little Ning knows that you will protect her. Little girl, you. Xietain didn't know whether to laugh or cry at the confidence this little girl had in him, even though he had barely known her for 3 days. What the hell, man? After all, you can act like that too. He sighed secretly and a smile formed on his face as he watched the little interaction between the two. Xietain took off his full coat and helped Luoning equip it. The treasure glowed and adjusted to the girl's stature automatically, showing just how powerful the soul record really was. With all of her natural stats gaining a +5 boost, the 9-year-old girl had no problem lifting Xiein's Xianyuan sword and slashed a couple of times with relative ease. Follow me and don't be afraid. Xietain took the girl's hand and advanced to meet the zombies slowly. As he saw them walking away, Luocheng opened his mouth to say something but in the end, shook his head and sighed. His eyes filled with worry stared at the back of his only family as he silently prayed for her safety. Don't worry. Kong Lan stepped closer and pointed out the undeniable truth. There's no way a few level 5 zombies can hurt someone he wishes to protect. Although I have my differences with him, I must say that at least he's a man who keeps his word and so far hasn't tried to bite off more than he can handle. He reached over and lightly patted him on the shoulder. The two's words calmed Luocheng a little, but it was simply impossible for the worry to disappear completely. However, soon all that worry disappeared almost 100% within seconds when he witnessed the scene before him. Xietain waited for the zombies to approach, and as he felt the small hand he held squeezing tightly with his own, he looked at the girl beside him. You stay behind me, I'll take care of those zombies first and then you can level up just by giving the final hit. Okay, MMH. Luoning nodded with bright eyes and her eyebrows curved like a crescent moon. When the zombies were 20 meters away, Xietain seemed to disappear from his previous position and the ground under his feet cracked slightly due to the strength of his legs. Bang! 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 Luoning could not follow his movements, but she could hear the constant bangs, and for each bang, a zombie fell to the ground with its 4 broken limbs. Of course, each bang she heard was actually at least 4 explosions, but due to Xietan's speed, the time between each one wasn't too long, so they seemed like one. Although he had lost his full coat momentarily, with one hand covered by his piercing glove and with his feet protected by the velocity boots, Xietain was not afraid of zombies. Besides, with his overwhelmingly superior agility compared to the slow zombies, there was no way he would be in danger unless he was surrounded on all sides. After a minute, the 70 or so zombies lay on the ground growling furiously. However, although their appearances were still as horrifying as before, the danger they posed had practically dropped to the lowest possible level. Luoning carefully approached under Xietan's guidance and noticed how each zombie had the bones of both arms and legs completely destroyed beyond recognition. The girl's face turned pale at the bloody scene, but she gritted her teeth and endured. Although she was a child, she was actually not as naive as she looked. Luoning was aware that the world she knew would never return. Precisely because of this, she desperately wanted strength not only for herself, but also to protect her loved ones. Just take 3 small steps forward and cut off the head. You don't need to get any closer than that. Xietain pointed at the first zombie and instructed. Following his words, Luoning took 3 small steps forward and raised the Xianyuan sword high into the sky before slashing downwards as a faint battle cry came out of her mouth. With a blade over 1 meter in length, the sword's edge easily severed the zombie's head. Although it failed to hit the neck, the brain turned to mush and the life of the human who failed to adapt to the world's mana was finally over. You have acquired the soul power of normal zombie level 5. Stamina plus 3. As time passed, the level of the zombies also slowly ascended. At the beginning of the apocalypse, most of the zombies were level 2 or level 3, while level 4 zombies were relatively rarer. However, now all of these zombies were level 4 or level 5. This meant that mankind had to hurry up and become stronger if they did not want to be devoured by the other beings wandering the earth. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 144 Summon Shadowcat and Elite Troop. In the past, Xietain had once asked Lilith about zombies. What kind of path did they follow? How did they evolve? Her answer was very simple but extremely clear, and without leaving any misunderstanding: zombies evolve by devouring other living beings. But they can also absorb mana from the world. The problem was that when evolving by forcibly absorbing mana from the world, the evolution could not be chosen by oneself, just as when absorbing soul power from another existence. This meant that the evolution was almost 100% of the time countless instances weaker, and a second-order existence that had evolved incorrectly did not necessarily possess the power of a true first-order existence. It was a similar case to the first-order blood-sucking bee that Xietain had killed after setting fire to the mutant forest. Due to its bad evolution after absorbing the mana that the mana embryo expelled, the blood-sucking bee had lost all mobility except for its wings due to its disproportionate body. However, this did not overshadow the fact that the zombies evolved relentlessly, which was incredibly frightening considering they were creatures that never slept and possessed seemingly infinite stamina. While the zombies and other creatures were evolving, most humans were hiding in some corner, and only the vast minority actually had the courage to come out and fight. Xietain noticed that the girl's hands were trembling slightly as she gripped the sword with all her heart. He walked over and calmed her down, praising her for her good work. "See, this is your skill." He pointed to the skill scroll that had fallen next to the slain zombie's body. My skill." Luoning followed his glance and her eyes shone. The girl seemed to forget her fears as she clutched Xietan's shirt tightly and said cheerfully, "That's my skill? Just like Big Brother Bai, I can also have a cool skill?" Xietain chuckled and nodded. "That's right. It's yours. Let me pick it up for you. Hurry up, Big Brother. Hurry up." The little girl jumped like a rabbit all over the place as she pushed him forward. She still didn't dare to pick up something that was so close to the zombie's bloodied and messed up body after all. After picking up the scroll under Luoning's anxious eyes, the contents of the skill flashed in his retina. Summon Shadowcat, First Order Active Skill, Level 2, spend 5 mana points to summon a Shadowcat and consume 2 mana points for every 5 seconds. The Shadowcat can blend in and camouflage itself with the darkness to become almost undetectable to the enemy's eyes, making it a perfect beast for surprise attacks. The skill is currently limited to 1 Shadowcat. Xietain raised an eyebrow and handed the skill to the little girl. Little Luoning's eyes shone with joy, and under Xietan's guidance, the white scroll with dark speckles turned into particles of light that soon disappeared inside her body. "Luoning, let's continue to raise your level to increase your mana as much as possible, and later we can see what your skill can do." Xietain gently ruffled her hair, and the girl nodded excitedly before dashing forward like a little tigress, decapitating zombie after zombie. In fact, Luoning was so happy that she ignored the pool of blood that had formed around her and seemed unaware that her Minnie and Mickey cartoon boots had been dyed red. Because she had received Xietan's help, Luoning only rose to level 1 after killing 3 levels 5 zombies, which was noticeably lower than Xietain. At that time he had directly risen to level 1 after killing the level 5 Big B. This meant that due to his assistance, Luoning was receiving about 1/3 of the soul power she could have gained if she had killed the zombies by herself. 7 more zombies took her to level 2. 15 more zombies took her directly to level 3. Luoning needed to decapitate 31 zombies of level 5 more to finally reach level 4. Under Xietan's guidance, the 8 status points she had gained were used to boost her mana stat only as her skill consumed large amounts of mana to work. With only about 20 zombies remaining, he and she knew that it was impossible to gain enough soul power to level up to level 5, so Xietain decided to do something else. When Xietain led Luoning back to where the troops were stationed, the girl ran to Luocheng to tell him the news. As for Xietain himself, he looked at the militants and said in a deep voice, "Now I am giving you the opportunity to evolve almost without risk." Everyone looked at him carefully and he pointed at the zombies in the distance as he said, "Approximately 20 zombies were disabled by me, so that means a total of 7 people can go up 1 level and gain status points to become stronger. Are any of you interested? Let me warn you in advance, those who step forward will have to fight with swords and blades without relying on firearms frequently from this day forward." The 30 armed men looked each other in the eye. Most hesitated but in the end did not want to move forward. Fighting from long range was fine, but risking to die in a melee battle was still hard to accept. Although they were ashamed as they looked at the 9-year-old girl who had dared to fight, shame could not overcome the fear of death. However, there were several brave ones who stepped forward without hesitation. Xietain looked at the 12 men who stood out from the rest and nodded in satisfaction as he silently thought, after all, these people went through many hardships. In 30 of them more than a third have the determination to fight, while among hundreds of well-fed and protected students only a few dared. Since we are currently short of zombies, only 7 of you will be able to level up. But don't worry. You will all be raised by me and turned into an elite troop. Xietain promised honestly and saw the eyes of the 12 men glitter with fervor as they looked at him, Chen He, Fu Xiefeng, and Kong Lan. They all had seen the power that each of them had, and those who were hot-blooded naturally hoped that they could acquire similar strength. Many present had lost their families during the course of the apocalypse and hated zombies and mutated beasts to the bone marrow. Now that someone had given them a chance for revenge, these men were naturally more than grateful and gladly stepped forward. Blades, iron pipes, wooden sticks, even with the butt of the gun they had, 7 of the 12 men who had stood out advanced, and after making sure that the only remaining danger in the zombies was their teeth, they began to bash their heads into a bloody mess. Once, twice, 3 times. After killing 3 levels 5 zombies each, all 7 men received the same message in their retinas. You have leveled up to level 1. You have acquired 2 status points to distribute freely. A few meters away, Xietain smiled slightly. Little by little, an elite troop was forming under his flag, and there would come a time in the future when just hearing its name would be enough to terrify any being. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 145, Increasing the Number of Survivors. After wiping out the 1,000+ zombies, the troop of 30 armed men led by Xietain made its way into the small town. As the engine of the convoy entered the streets of the village, some straggling zombies that had remained inside the town began to move toward them while growling in a threatening manner. Chen He, Fu Xiefeng, and Kong Lan jumped out of the vehicles they were riding in and charged forward separately in search of remaining zombies. In a matter of seconds, the approaching zombies were decapitated with ease. Inside the jeep leading the way, Xietain was sitting in the passenger seat with Luoning sitting comfortably on his lap. "All right, Luoning. Can you see that zombie? Right inside that house over there." Xietain looked out the window of the jeep and pointed at a particular zombie that was stuck inside a house and could not move as some heavy objects were obstructing the passage. The girl looked to where he pointed and faintly noticed the zombie's head through the broken glass of the window. "Big brother, I see it. Good." Xietain nodded, and as he patted her head he urged, "Let's see what your skill can do then." Luoning's eyes flashed happily. She had been waiting for Xietain to ask her to use her skill since she was also curious, so she didn't even hesitate and opened her palm while pointing forward. From the ground outside the jeep the shadow seemed to twist and soon a strange creature appeared. As Luoning jumped up excitedly and clapped her hands, Xietain raised an eyebrow as he inspected the strange monster. Although it indeed looked like a cat, it was actually not a normal cat like the pets people had before the apocalypse. This cat was the size of a Siberian dog. Its body was completely black as night while its eyes were as yellow as the sun. "Go." Luoning pointed at the zombie and the shadow cat's eyes flashed before charging forward without thinking. The shadow cat's speed was very fast, about 4 times faster than a normal person. However, what surprised Xietain and everyone watching most was that when the shadow cat jumped through the window and its body touched the shadows it seemed to have disappeared as if by magic. "Where is it?" "Disappeared?" Chen He was dumbfounded and couldn't help but look everywhere looking for the creature summoned by Luoning. "No. It's still right in front of us." Xietain narrowed his eyes and just barely, ever so slightly, he could see how the shadows seemed to have a life of their own as they moved towards the zombie. Swoosh! The zombie didn't even have time to growl as the shadow of its own body suddenly distorted and the shadow cat jumped as it slashed with its claw horizontally. The zombie's head flew through the air and the lifeless body soon collapsed on the ground. What the hell? Strong. Fu Xiafeng, Kong Lan, and Shen He were dumbfounded. The power of that summoned creature was truly horrifying. Luo Cheng looked at his little sister with wide eyes. Not only was he shocked that such power came from her, he was also incredibly happy. Now she would undoubtedly have a better chance of living and her safety would be much higher even if something happened to him. He. Big brother Bai, how do you like my cat? Luo Ning laughed merrily and cancelled her skill because the consumption was really high for the current her. In order to make full use of her skill, she needed to constantly level up. Very strong. Little Ning, from now on you are an evolved person just like me. Xietain ruffled her hair happily while secretly being surprised. Were the summons that strong? Xietain wasn't sure before since Yang Pei's summons had been casually slapped to death by him. However, after seeing Luo Ning's shadow cat power he had to rethink that thought. After about 30 minutes, the entire town was inspected. House by house and every corner, everything was carefully explored without leaving even a single loophole. Several zombies were locked inside some houses and were taken care of by the armed troops with relative ease. In addition, inside some cellars and some houses with iron doors were found some survivors who were starving after not having eaten anything for more than half a month. 2 hours later, sitting in the living room of a small villa inside the town, Xietain listened carefully to Lilith's report in her human form. A total of 364 survivors were found inside the town. In addition, several rations were also found in some stores and inside some houses. The total ration equivalent is approximately 200 to 300 kilos of food plus water and other beverages. There were also some packs of cigarettes and, while listening to her melodious voice, Xietain could not help but silently admire her. Dressed in a small police uniform that accentuated the curves of her body, Lilith looked like a brave warrior, which was a new sight for him. That's all. She lifted her face from the sheet of documents the little leaders of the different units had handed her and smiled sweetly towards him. Xietain smiled back and thank you for the help, Lily. Although they were currently alone inside the room, it was best to be careful, so he referred to her by her false name instead of the real one. It's a pleasure to be of assistance to you. She replied and licked her lips playfully while looking at a certain part of his body. Before Xietain could have any kind of reaction and respond to her, the door of the living room was softly opened. An armed man belonging to Xietan's troops entered along with a rather emaciated woman whose skin had begun to turn somewhat yellow due to the lack of light for so long as well as illnesses from not being able to access clean water and the starvation she had experienced. Leader by Miss Lily. The militant bowed respectfully to both of them. Xietain nodded and looked at the woman curiously. What is going on? This woman secured with her life that she has important information that might interest you, leader. The militant responded in a serious voice before looking at the woman and urging, this is our leader. You can tell him whatever you have to say. The woman hesitated. She looked at Xietain for several seconds before asking somewhat fearfully, Hello, Leader Bai. My name is Mu Yang. May I ask how is the world now? What's happening with the government and the army? She, like the rest of the survivors found in the village, had been locked inside her house and had not dared to stick her head out of the window since the first sign of chaos when the message from the soul record flashed in her retina. All of Xietan's troops were wearing police uniforms that had been acquired from the police station near the beginning village before. Therefore, Mu Yang probably assumed that they were part of the government. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 146 Goblin, New Age Monsters. Xietain looked at the woman before him for a moment. In his head, he was thinking of all kinds of important information that this woman named Mu Yang might have, but even after careful thought, he did not manage to come up with a clear answer. It was hard for him to understand how a person who had not left her home could have important information. Still, he decided to be honest. Xietain sat with his back completely straight and said in a deep voice. The central government has not contacted anyone, nor have they sent signals of any kind. The country's military forces probably collapsed or are in a big trouble, since even after more than half a month there is still no trace of them either. The sooner you accept that the old society no longer exists, the better it will be for you, as many things will be simpler that way. Mu Yangyang's face changed slightly and her eyes quivered with fear. Although deep in her heart she had expected something like this to happen from the moment that strange message appeared in her retina and the zombies began to devour the humans, the realization was still cruel. So you all, Mu Yangyang looked at the police uniform of the armed man who had led her here and then hesitantly looked at the female police uniform Lilith was wearing before looking at Baizemin cautiously. Baizemin nodded and confirmed his suspicions. We are a group of survivors who are facing the zombies and mutated and evolved beasts. Although in our group there are also members of the government and military troops. The reason why Baizemin said those last words was because although he was strong, it was natural for people who did not know him to trust someone with status and from a leading family. In any case, when Mu Yangyang fully understood the new world, she would realize on her own that such things were no longer of importance. Evolved beasts? Mutated beasts? Mu Yangyang's eyes widened in shock. She had only seen normal zombies. As for mutated or evolved beasts, she knew nothing about it. However, the words of the young man in front of her made her even more confident of what she had seen. Due to the mana of the world, the animals mutated and gained terrifying strength and speed. Some of them managed to evolve into something completely new and gained the ability to use supernatural skills just like me. After saying those words, Baizemin made a small cut on his finger and activated his blood manipulation skill. Under the surprised gaze of the survivor, small strands of blood floated in the air and wrapped into a small red sphere. Swoosh! Under Baizemin's control, the liquid blood hardened to terrifying levels and turned into a bullet that shot towards one of the walls. Bang! My God! The female survivor took a frightened step back as she saw that the concrete wall had been pierced by the blood of a human being. Such a thing was simply unheard of. Her look at Baizemin changed completely, and even the militant's eyes now had another small notch of respect in them. Only now he realized that earlier, Baizemin had not gone all out. Baizemin looked at the woman and said in a deep voice, Mu Yangyang, as you just saw, the world has changed. In our group we have strict rules as food, safest places, etc., are too valuable nowadays. Depending on how important that information you have is, I may let you enjoy the treatment of a noble citizen under my rule. Even a royalty is not impossible. Mu Yangyang might not know what a royalty or a noble citizen was, but seeing the militant's envious eyes when the word royalty was named, she understood that it was definitely a good thing. In the end, she gritted her teeth and nodded. Okay, I'll tell you. It turns out that when the apocalypse broke out, Mu Yangyang had managed to survive because she had reacted at the first moment and sought refuge in her home. Because her house had a metal door and the windows had steel bars, the zombies had not been able to reach her. The problem was that after 3 days, Mu Yangyang had exhausted all the rations she had in her house, so that's when the real hell began for her. The days of starvation were unbearable. Her stomach roared with hunger and ached as if thousands of needles were constantly pricking her. Mu Yangyang rolled around on the ground for a total of 7 days straight without eating anything, and the hunger was driving her crazy. So when the 10th day of the apocalypse came, under the effects of hunger, she decided to do what many other survivors had decided to do in desperate times: go out in search of food. For her, it no longer mattered if she ended up being eaten by the zombies. Hunger was simply driving her completely insane. However, just when Mu Yangyang had consumed a great deal of energy as well as determination to stand up and walk towards the door, she heard something from outside that made her stop her movements completely. Mu Yangyang trembled with fear, and had it not been for the militant beside him, he would have fallen to the ground. Baizemin told her to sit down, and only then she continued. That sound was very strange. It was like a human's laughter, but it was definitely not something a human being could make. Mu Yangyang explained in terror. As a precaution, I decided to look outside through the small porthole in the door. That's when I saw that little green monster. Baizemin narrowed his eyes, and upon seeing the slight change in Lilith's expression, his face became serious. He looked at the militant and ordered him to retreat. Moreover, he also told him that if a word of this leaked out, his head would fly up in the air. After the gunman left in fright, Bai Zemin looked at the surviving woman who was trembling scared, and urged in a deep voice, "Continue. That little green monster was ugly, just like the goblins that appear in fantasy stories." Mu Yongyang exclaimed in a high-pitched voice. Its mouth was incredibly big, just like its nose, long and sharp teeth. Its size didn't even reach a meter in height, and its ears were long and pointed while its eyes were golden like gold. It was definitely a goblin like the one in fairy tales. That must be a new age monster. Lilith's voice rang in his head, and Bai Zemin looked at her with questioning eyes. She explained, "Mana is an energy that no one has managed to fully comprehend. In the different worlds that the soul record visits, it is normal for some never-before-seen species to start appearing on Earth due to the influence of mana on the different species. Monsters that simply mutate or evolve are considered original monsters, in other words, those that already existed in this world before. As for the new species that are born under the influence of the soul record and mana, these are called New Age monsters. These monsters are far more dangerous than the original monsters in the initial and intermediate stages of each world." Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 147 Goblins Appear, Assault in the Middle of the Road. Bai Zemin's breathing stalled slightly as Lilith's words reached him, and for a moment it seemed as if his brain had stopped working. If due to mana and the soul record new life forms could form over time, didn't this mean that the more time passed, not only would zombies and animals mutate and evolve even more, but also other unknown creatures even more powerful would appear? So far, Bai Zemin had encountered mutated and evolved insects such as the great fast mantis and the first order blazing beetle. He had also fought dogs, cats, snakes, tigers, and other mutated and evolved animals. However, for better or worse, these monsters were creatures that, while they had become infinitely more powerful than in the past, some of their weaknesses were still present. For example, during his battle to the death against the First Order blazing beetle, Bai Zemin knew that the beetles could not turn their bodies, and he took advantage of that weakness to kill it. But if other unknown beings appeared, this small advantage of knowledge about enemy biology would no longer be present in most cases. Bai Zemin took a deep breath and looked at Mu Yongyang with sharp eyes. "Are you sure about what you just said?" Mu Yongyang felt a heavy aura hovering over her, and with a pale face nodded repeatedly as she stammered, I swear. It really was a small monster like a goblin. Besides, this goblin even took some survivors alive to the south. I saw the whole scene. I see." Bai Zemin nodded, and his expression returned to indifference. "The information you just provided is of utmost importance to me. I will arrange for you to be granted a villa in the center of the camp, and you will be allowed to enjoy the privileges of a low-level royalty. Someone will explain the rules and benefits of your new position to you soon. Thank you." "Thank you." Mu Yongyang stood up and bowed as tears of pain, suffering, and joy spilled down her cheeks. While she didn't know what was a royalty, it was definitely a good thing. At this point, she just wanted to eat and sleep in a litter, comfortably, without having to fear the dangers lurking outside for at least one night. Soon, Mu Yongyang was escorted by 2 armed men to a separate villa where several survivors in charge of meals prepared a table of dishes for her to eat at will. After taking a hot shower and changing clothes, while looking at the rice, chicken soup, vegetables, and fried meat as well as the different choices of drinks on the table, Mu Yongyang again cried bitter tears and enjoyed from the depths of her heart what for her was the best meal she had ever had in her entire life. While Mu Yongyang was being taken to rest and due to the sudden increase of survivors, Bai Zemin had sent a messenger to the beginning village to report the situation to Shangguan Bingshui. 3 hours later, in the middle of a road about 10 kilometers from Bai Zemin's current location, a convoy of 3 buses and 2 SUVs were moving at a steady speed in a southerly direction. Inside the SUV leading the way, Shangguan Bingshui was sitting in the back seat while looking out the window with an indifferent gaze. She had received Bai Zemin's report, and after discussing it with Wu Yijun, she decided to bring some men to pick up the survivors and take them back to the beginning village. After all, they could not currently afford to separate their meager forces into 2 villages. The young driver's eyes occasionally looked in the rearview mirror, and the man couldn't help but sigh at the icy beauty. However, for fear of losing his mind, his glance did not linger for more than a second at a time before returning to the road. Swoosh! Suddenly Shangguan Bingshue's face changed slightly and without hesitation she slammed the door before rushing out without flinching. The vehicle that was traveling at about 30 to 40 kilometers per hour due to the bad condition of the road continued to move forward for a few more meters before it suddenly began to split in two. Boom! Without warning, the car exploded in a cloud of fire, killing the driver in the process. The convoy traveling behind immediately came to a screeching halt, barely avoiding a car crash. Nobody get out of the vehicles. Shangguan Bingshue appeared in front of the buses and coldly ordered while looking towards the forest on their right. Because there were only about 60 armed men in total due to the shortage of firearms and ammunition, Shangguan Bingshue had left the other 30 with Wu Yijun and Kai Jinji in the beginning village to avoid any kind of disturbance. This meant that she was the only person with actual combat ability within this group of survivors. Kikikiki. A strange sound similar to a person's laughter, but also similar to the screeching sound of two metal plates rubbing against each other came from between the trees. Shangguan Bingshue did not stop on ceremony and unhesitatingly activated her most reliable skill as she pointed her wand forward. Freeze. A thick white cloud burst out of her body and in the next instant surrounded the trees in front of her. The trees began to freeze bit by bit and less than 5 seconds later, everything 10 meters ahead had turned into ice statues. The place remained silent and a gentle gust of wind made Shangguan Bingshue's combat dress dance in the breeze gently. Her face suddenly changed and as she gritted her teeth she created a large wall of ice in front of her before putting strength into both legs and jumping backwards. Swoosh. 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 Following the sound of the howling wind, a dozen arrows flew from the shadows of the forest and hit the ice wall but failed to pierce it completely before getting stuck. Just as Shangguan Bingshue touched down 10 meters away, a shadow shot out from the forest. Bang! The thick ice wall that was capable of stopping even bullets from multiple guns was smashed into hundreds of pieces that flew everywhere. However, Shangguan Bingshue was more surprised by the creature in front of her. Approximately 5 feet tall, a big belly, thick arms covered with fat, sharp-pointed ears, huge nose, bulging yellow eyes, teeth that protruded in point, and in one of its hands it carried a huge white bone while it was completely naked except for a brown-colored rag loincloth that covered the lower half of its body. Go Goblin! Shangguan Bingshue's beautiful eyes flashed with disbelief and for the first time, she couldn't help but stutter in shock. Kikikiki. The fat goblin with a big bone stick laughed and while pointing at her shouted some strange words. Shangguan Bingshue frowned and soon, to her utmost surprise, 12 small goblins barely half the size of the goblin in front of her came out of the forest. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 148 First Order Shangguan Bingshue, Charming Ice, Part 1. These 12 small goblins, about a meter tall, also wore loincloths made of tattered rags that barely covered the lower part of their bodies. However, the clearest distinction with the big goblin apart from the size and the big belly was their weapons. While the fat goblin wielded a large white bone, the smaller goblins had wooden crossbows in their hands and a small quiver with sharp bone arrows on their backs. All of you follow the road and look for Baizemin and the rest. Shangguan Bingshue ordered calmly and without waiting for a response from the convoy drivers dashed off into the forest behind her. Seeing her disappear into the shadows so quickly, the highest goblin shouted some sharp words and chased at full speed while the smaller goblins shouted and ran after quickly. The drivers didn't linger to think things over and set the vehicles in motion in a hurry, turning into a gust of wind and dust that soon disappeared in the horizon towards the village where Baizemin and the rest were currently stationed. Due to the existence of the mana, the forests and plants had mutated. Shangguan Bingshue ran for 5 minutes, and all she saw was green, green, and more green. Knowing that it was not good for her to go too far into the great forests of China, she stopped in the middle of a large clearing as she had noticed that the fat goblin's aura was fixedly focused on her, which meant that due to their equivalent speeds, she could not leave the monster behind. Swoosh. 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 Immediately after she stopped, the wind swooshed and Shangguan Bingshue swiftly retreated, causing the bone arrows to miss their target and instead hit the ground and the trees behind. Kakik. The fat goblin stepped out of the shadows of the forest and laughed loudly as it looked at her and licked its dry lips with its monstrous tongue. Although the goblins of the fantasy stories were not necessarily the same as the goblins born from the mana of the world, at least their lewdness was the same considering the lustful eyes the little creatures had when they looked at the beautiful woman in front of them. Shangguan Bingshui was never a woman of many words, so after judging and identifying her enemy she immediately began to attack with no other intention but to end the other side's life. Ice thorns. Under her command, the ground in front of the fat goblin suddenly froze and several sharp-tipped thorns shot out without warning. The fat goblin snorted through its nose and without any strange act struck forward with its bone stick, destroying the ice thorns with utter ease before charging forward while laughing wildly. Shangguan Bingshui frowned slightly as the enemy's physical strength was really annoying. Her ice maker skill was great for attacks, defenses, and even traps, but it wasn't as destructive as fire-type skills or other attacking elements. The fat goblin swung its bone stick and hacked horizontally. Although the bone stick was not sharp, it was incredibly hard, so if this attack hit her she could definitely break a rib or two. Shangguan Bingshui jumped high into the air, evading the attack, and waved her hand creating several ice bullets before shooting them forward. The ice bullets hit the fat goblin's body, but all of them exploded on its tough skin and turned into water that ran down its body. The beast laughed out loud as if it was sneering. The 12 small goblins raised their crossbows while laughing like wild children and shot towards Shangguan Bingshui, who had not yet touched solid ground. Being in midair, it was simply impossible to dodge. Therefore, Shangguan Bingshui created a small ice platform under her feet and hurriedly used it to propel herself to the side, barely avoiding the bone arrows. Just before reaching the ground, she pointed with her wand and coldly said, "Ice arrow." Immediately, over 20 ice arrows were crafted and with a wave of her hands were launched forward at astonishing speeds. Being level 25, just one step away from evolving, Shangguan Bingshui was way more powerful than the small goblins. The small beasts could not even react when the more than 20 arrows pierced them in the head, chest, heart, abdomen, and other parts of their bodies. You have acquired the soul power of Wild Goblin level 16. You have acquired the soul power of Wild Goblin level 13. 12 messages quickly flashed in her retina, and Shangguan Bingshui finally realized that these creatures really were goblins, and not just identical in appearance. After all, the soul record possessed the power to read the very soul and source of every being in the universe. At the quick death of its comrades of the same race, the fat goblin laughed with its high-pitched voice, and as if it cared nothing about it charged forward again with the intention of injuring her severely. Right. From the beginning the goblins were aiming to injure and capture her, not kill her. As for the reason, she was clear about the purpose. Shangguan Bingshui couldn't help but chuckle coldly, and her red lips curved into a strange smile. Ice vines. From the ground, dozens of frozen but incredibly flexible vines shot out towards the fat goblin, successfully stopping its charge. The beast growled as the fat on its body seemed to vibrate, causing the ice vines to crack rapidly. Shangguan Bingshui expended 60% of her remaining mana and crafted a small, delicate ice sword. She rushed forward in a hurry, knowing that her time was limited as the vines definitely could not hold out for more than a second or two at most. Just before the vines exploded into thousands of tiny ice fragments, she managed to make a light slash at the fat goblin's body before being forced to retreat as the large bone stick hit the ground where she was previously standing, shaking the earth hard. Keek-a-keek-a-keek-keek. The fat goblin touched the wound on its chest from where some green blood was barely trickling out and burst out laughing. Shangguan Bingshui noticed that the wound was too light and could not help but frown slightly. Although this ice sword had consumed practically all her mana, she could barely pierce through the skin of the enemy before her. Worst of all, to maintain the ice sword she needed to constantly consume mana, so at most she needed to finish the battle in 30 seconds before she was powerless. While Shangguan Bingshui had great control over her own mana, it was impossible to completely master it in such a short time. Even she, just like Bai Zemin, could not help but overconsume when she found herself in too tough a fight because a small mistake in activating her skill could make a big difference in energy consumption. The fat goblin licked its bloody hand and charged forward again. Its eyes flashed with unbridled madness and burning lust. It was as if the beast knew no fear, or as if it could feel no pain from the wound in its chest. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 149, First Order Shangguan Bingshui, Charming Ice, Part 2 Last. What? Inside the main villa of the village recently recaptured by Xietain and his troops, he abruptly stood up and his eyes flashed with a hint of surprise as he looked at the young man in front of him. "Are you telling me that halfway there appeared a dozen of goblins?" he asked as if to confirm that he hadn't misheard the previous report. "Why, yes." The young driver and the rest of the drivers in the caravan led by Shangguan Bingshui nodded immediately. One of them exclaimed worried and frightened, "Leader Bai, one of those goblins was really big and looked powerful. Miss Shangguan Bingshui told us to go ahead to report the situation to you, but she was left fighting alone against those strange creatures. Damn it." Bai Xietain couldn't help but curse and quickly disappeared from his position, charging towards the northern road. He hadn't expected the goblins to suddenly attack someone in his group when he had only just learned that these creatures existed. In the same clearing within the forest, Shangguan Bingshui was engaged in a fierce battle against the fat goblin. Each of them had their respective advantages and disadvantages, so from an outsider's point of view, it might appear that they were evenly matched. However, the reality was that Shangguan Bingshui's situation was quite complex at the moment. Swoosh! She slashed with the ice sword in her hands, and a new wound appeared on the fat goblin's back that was now riddled with light cuts from which green blood was constantly spurting out. Keek keek keek. The fat goblin laughed and swung its bone stick backward, causing the air around it to blast, unable to withstand the pressure. Shangguan Bingshui's beautiful face was as cold as the personification of the ice itself. She muttered a few words, and a thick ice wall rose up between her and the fat goblin as she jumped backward in a hurry. Boom! When the white bone stick slammed into the ice wall, the force contained by the attack made by the fat goblin caused the mighty defensive wall to withstand no more than a second before breaking into thousands of tiny pieces of ice. Shangguan Bingshui's silver hair danced disorderly with the shockwave resulting from the previous explosion. Her face was almost as white as a sheet and her ample bosom rose and fell steadily as a small bead of sweat slid silently down her small nose. Shangguan Bingshui's total mana was just over 220, but even though the battle against the fat goblin had barely extended for about 5 minutes since it erupted, her total mana had decayed to just over 70 total points. The constant activation of her first-order ice maker skill to make vines, thorns, bullets, ice pikes, and ice walls to contain the enemy's explosive movements and attacks before her, as well as the creation of the ice sword charged with mana and magical power, had drained her mana relentlessly. Moreover, to maintain her only weapon, she needed to administer mana charges constantly and practically without rest. At this rate, she could barely last a few more seconds before losing most of her battle power. Keek 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 keek. She looked over and saw the fat goblin laugh. Even though the creature's body was plagued with cuts and blood had stained its entire body as well as the ground beneath it, it was still laughing loudly as it looked at her and licked its broken lips. She gritted her teeth and charged forward again, engaging in a dangerous hand-to-hand battle in which the slightest of mistakes could cost her dignity as a woman if not her life. Shangguan Bingshui launched ice bullets, striking the fat goblin's body again and again. Although her attacks clearly had no effect, she continued to perform the same action relentlessly. The fat goblin had a mocking smile and charged like an unstoppable locomotive as it defied the ice bullets and swung its bone stick fiercely in all directions. Boom! 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 Ice wall after ice wall were destroyed by the goblin's fierce blows, and Shangguan Bingshui was forced to retreat repeatedly until finally her mana fell dangerously. She looked at the enemy goblin and dropped the ice sword. With a pale face, she observed how the weapon she had created after consuming much of her mana disappeared at the same time as she stopped losing mana to maintain it. The goblin laughed out loud and took a step forward when suddenly its fierce and lustful expression froze completely. For the first time, the monster's eyes glittered with a tinge of fear as stared in front of it and its entire body quivered. No. Wait. Bai Xietain, who had traveled 10 kilometers in the blink of an eye and had been searching for Shangguan Bingshui through the forest, stopped his movements when he heard the delicate cry behind him. The Xianyuan sword shone coldly with the sun's rays reflecting off the blade, and a bead of sweat slid down the goblin's face. The fat goblin could feel death, absolute death, coming from the dark eyes of the human before it. It was like when the sun was covered by the moon and the night seemed to descend unexpectedly after the appearance of the eclipse that blocked the light. What? Baizemin jumped back to make distance between him and the monster and looked at Shangguan Bingshui as if he were looking at a crazy woman. Did she want him not to kill the goblin? Her face was terribly pale and her breathing was irregular, which clearly indicated excessive consumption of mana and stamina. Besides, Baizemin had arrived just in time to see the ice sword fall from her hands. "You'll act arrogant even now," he couldn't help but rebuke with a frown. Shangguan Bingshui shook her head and looked at him with clear eyes. "It's not that. This goblin is just what I need to evolve to the next stage. Just look carefully and you'll understand." Baizemin frowned and nodded before jumping towards a tree behind him. His eyes fixed on the goblin, waiting to kill it in case she couldn't do something about it. Though he hoped she would become stronger, as that way she would be more useful. If she died, nothing he had done so far would make sense. The fat goblin suddenly roared and charged forward. Its lustful eyes had disappeared and turned bloodshot. Due to the appearance of a much more powerful enemy with such a horrifying soul power, the fat goblin had decided to kill the woman to absorb some of her soul power and evolve to have a chance of defeating the human man. Shangguan Bingshui smiled. Her smile, though exhausted, was bright and warm like the rays of the sun that illuminated the entire world. For a moment, Baizemin could not help but even compare her to Lilith's smiles. That's how beautiful her current smile was. She raised her flawless right hand and whispered, "Burn." The blazing ring on her index finger glowed and a mighty burst of crimson flame shot out, enveloping the goblin completely. The creature roared in pain and the skin on its body began to vibrate. Surprisingly, after a couple of seconds, the crimson flames burst outward and disappeared into midair. The beast had managed to shake them off with its strange skill. The goblin's body had some burns, but the most striking thing was the amount of hot steam coming out of its skin. This hot steam was burning the monster's body little by little, and its source was, surprisingly, all the water that had been left in its pores. Water that had formed from the ice bullets launched by Shangguan Bingshui since the beginning of the battle. What happens when something cold collides with something extremely hot? Shangguan Bingshui looked at Baizemin with her smile still imprinted on her exhausted face. Then what happens when an extremely hot object comes into contact with something extremely cold? Baizemin's eyes flashed with realization and he couldn't help but feel admiration towards the woman in front of him. Shangguan Bingshui turned her eyes to the goblin in front of her and said indifferently as she pointed her wand at it, "Freeze." Spending her remaining 30 mana points, a blast of freezing air struck the goblin's body and encased it in a statue of ice. However, the beast did not give up and fought. Its body vibrated strangely and cracks began to spread through all the ice that was holding it back. A few seconds later, the ice broke completely and the goblin roared once more before stepping forward. However, just as it had just lifted its foot to move forward, the beast's eyes widened. Crack. 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 Tiny, minuscule cracks appeared on its right leg that in a matter of milliseconds spread throughout its entire body. Baizemin could clearly see how the goblin's entire body was riddled with cracks as if it were a vase about to shatter into pieces. Indeed, the comparison was not too far from reality. Bang! At the same time as a big orb of soul power entered Shangguan Bingshui's body, several messages flashed in her retina. However, there was one in particular that fascinated her. "You have successfully evolved to First Order and obtained the unique class Charming Ice." It was then that her smile widened even more, and as the sun's rays hovered over her, Baizemin couldn't help but think that perhaps angels really did look that beautiful. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 150 Unique Class, Charming Ice. You have acquired the soul power of First Order Heavy Hobgoblin level 47. Freeze unclassified enemies, 5000/5000. Kill unclassified enemies using the Ice Maker skill, 2000/2000. Kill First Order enemies, 2/2. Charm an enemy with your natural beauty, 1/1. You have successfully evolved to First Order and acquired the unique class Charming Ice. Your innate beauty is worth contemplating and appreciating. As pure and unblemished as a flawless ice fairy. All ice-type attacks inflict 20% more damage and increase the resistance of your ice creations by another 20%. Your charm increases. You have acquired Second Order active skill level 1 Charming Eye. You have leveled up to level 32. You have gained 14 status points to distribute freely. All absorbed soul power has been calculated correctly. You get additional stats: strength plus 40, agility plus 29, stamina plus 25, health plus 20, mana plus 30, magic plus 27. Although Shangguan Bingshui had accumulated more soul power to level up than Bai Zemin by the time she successfully evolved, this was because he had advanced to First Order significantly faster than she had. With about a week more time accumulating experience, it was natural for her to level up a little more in comparison. However, even then, the amount of additional stats she had accumulated were far less than Bai Zemin's at that time. This was because Shangguan Bingshui had accumulated soul power from weaker existences, while Bai Zemin had fought and killed more than one First Order being before successfully evolving. After evolving to First Order, Shangguan Bingshui felt as if a new world had opened up before her, and her soul was strengthened in such a way that, for a moment, she herself could not believe it. But the most important thing for the present her was that after leveling up, her stamina regenerated to 100% immediately, and the mana gain due to the extra stats she had accumulated during the process of evolving to First Order had caused her completely pale face to gain some color again. Congratulations on evolving to First Order. A lazy voice brought her out of her inner fantasy world, and looking to the side she saw Bai Zemin waving his hand from a distance. Seeing as there are no more goblins around, and since you're okay, I'll head back to the village. That Chen He guy is probably out of his mind, since I assume he heard that you were attacked on the way. Leaving those words behind, Bai Zemin stomped his foot on the ground and disappeared from his position, leaving a gale behind him. Seeing this, Shangguan Bingshui's glance became a bit complicated, and she couldn't help but sigh as she sat down next to a tree, as although her stamina had regenerated, mental fatigue was present. Even though I just received a huge power boost, even though I can feel my soul power becoming infinitely purer than before I evolved, I still can't even understand how strong you are. Shangguan Bingshui muttered under her breath as she recalled that ghostly speed with which Bai Zemin disappeared, as well as the look of fear in the heavy hobgoblin's eyes. Shangguan Bingshui was a competitive woman by nature, and even more so against the opposite sex due to certain past events, as she wanted to prove herself that women could stand on their own and surpass men. However, the stronger she became, the more she felt that the distance between her and Bai Zemin increased. In the past, regardless of whether it was the talented and handsome Chen He or any other outstanding young man, Shangguan Bingshui had been able to surpass them all. From school grades to compatibility, she was simply perfect in every aspect. However, since the apocalypse broke out without warning, Bai Zemin had unconsciously become her greatest rival. She had strived to surpass him and, in fact, at some point their strength was not that far apart, and except for different strengths, their overall power was similar. But at some unknown moment, that normal-looking young man with an ordinary past with nothing to highlight simply shot into the sky, and now she could barely make out his shadow. Forget it. After a second sigh, her blue eyes turned to the shattered corpse of the heavy hobgoblin, and her lips curved into a cold smile. She had taken a risk when she had chosen the unique class Charming Ice, as the last requirement might be somewhat difficult. However, she knew she was beautiful and was confident in her beauty as well as her own strength. But after so many days, no human of the First Order had crossed her path, so her beauty had no use whatsoever. After all, the mutated and evolved monsters did not notice the beauties of mankind. Fortunately for her, goblins appeared, who were lustful by nature. Unaware that there was someone floating in the sky hundreds of meters above, Shangguan Bingshui stood up after resting for a moment and picked up the drop obtained from her victory. Above the white clouds, Lilith sighed before disappearing completely and without a trace. When Shangguan Bingshui first entered the village, Chen He ran up to her with a face pale in fright and hurriedly asked, "Bingshui, how are you? I just heard that a group of goblin-like monsters from the legends attacked you." Seeing her childhood friend's handsome face filled with worry, and she couldn't help but smile slightly. "Don't worry. Nothing happened to me, and Bai Zemin was also there in case his intervention was needed." This Chen He seemed to ignore much of her words and looked at her dumbfounded. After a few seconds, he noted, "Bingshui, have you become more beautiful or something?" Although Shangguan Bingshui was beautiful from before, when Chen He looked at her carefully now, he couldn't help but feel that she had suddenly become a little more beautiful than usual. This is because of... Shangguan Bingshui gave him a brief summary of what had happened as he led her towards the main villa. On the way, the armed men guarding the important areas saluted respectfully, and the survivors who had been ordered not to leave their homes temporarily looked out the windows at the scene, wondering what would become of their lives now. So, you've already evolved to First Order? Chen He was surprised. He was currently level 24, so he only now learned about evolutions and similar matters. Listening to Shangguan Bingshui, everything felt strange to him. That's right. She nodded, and a militant guarding the door to the hall inside the main villa quickly opened the closed door to allow them to pass through. Inside, Shangguan Bingshui and Chen He were greeted by the sight of Bai Zemin and Lily chatting with casual smiles. Occasionally she laughed at his jokes, or he grunted in annoyance at hers. These two definitely have something. Chen He cupped a hand over the side of his mouth and whispered, "Who knows?" Shangguan Bingshui replied, stepping into the room. "Bai Zemin, what's wrong with those goblins?" Bai Zemin, who was chatting with Lilith to relieve some of the tension he felt due to the appearance of a new type of enemy, was attracted by Shangguan Bingshui's unmistakable voice. He looked at her and Chen He before pointing to the seat in front of him and saying in a deep voice, "Sit down. We need to talk."